Okay, this is very special for me. We get to introduce, or I get to introduce Eric Ricaurte. Come on up. Eric is the founder and the CEO of a business called Greenview. Eric is truly an entrepreneur, and he's a consultant who works in hotel measurement, and he also works with a lot of tourism organizations. And those things are all really important, but what's really important is that Eric graduated from the Tisch Center with his master's degree 3 years ago. He served as Dean Hansen's graduate assistant, and I had the pleasure of having him in 3 classes. And so look what happened. Here he is. Welcome, Eric. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be back. Quick show of hands again. Please raise your hand if you plan on living in a big city and working for a fairly big company, or either one of those, Yeah, pretty easy in New York City, right? This is who I'm talking to, and this is what I'm talking about, sustainable tourism for the masses. Very interesting conversation we heard earlier from the panel, and when I was back in Quadri's class, in some of the reading, we found out that in the early 70s, when environmentalism was growing, at the same time we were starting to get psychographic studies on tourists. And so you had Cohen's work on the organized mass tourist, individual mass tourist, the explorer, the drifter. You had Plog's work on why destinations rise and fail, with the allocentric on one end, the person who goes to that destination like Costas, and then you got the psychocentric on the other side, the moon party people. You look at Butler's tourism area life cycle, where it documents how destinations exactly go through that phase over and over and over again. And you start to see this kind of thing is common, it's recurring. And so it's been in existence for years. And at the same time, those who were in the sustainable tourism field 20, 30 years ago were also those allocentrics, the explorers, the first arrivers, and the ones who wanted to protect it for those pristine destinations. But the common thread through all that literature is the mass tourist. The majority of the tourists, of travelers, fall in that bigger category. And that's what is the key change that we're seeing today in sustainable tourism, and my main message to you is to think about this from a mainstream way. There's a couple of trends I want to announce, 3 trends to consider there. First, mass tourism and tourism in general is growing. Some slides are presented, but it's growing in emerging markets. You had 50 million travelers to Hong Kong last year from China. Tibet last year. I remember in Prohaska's tourism planning class, we saw a tourism development plan, 1990, that Tibet by 2005 with some good governance, infrastructure, some trails, and targeted marketing to Japanese, Western Europeans, and Americans could reach 500,000 tourists. Tibet had 12.9 million tourists last year, most of them from China. And this is everywhere. I mean, this is not just the Chinese. You have all different emerging markets. I saw a show the other day. You had a Korean reality TV show of Korean actors, K-pop stars, some K-pop backup dancers going to Papua New Guinea and hanging out with the natives. And this is a reality TV show of all different types of people, and they're sitting there, you know, oh, ramen choyo, and other, like, everybody's interacting with everybody now, so it's much more massive. And so the issue is that we have a couple other pieces. Urbanism. In 2008, marked the first time in the history of the world that more people lived in cities than lived in rural areas. So the masses are growing, the mass travelers are growing, and cities are growing. But the third trend is that sustainability is now mainstream. It's everywhere. It's ubiquitous. Green sustainability, you see it everywhere. Most companies have sustainability programs. Look at this seriously. 56% of Americans now believe that climate change is actually causing the crazy weather that we're looking at. And 63% of global CEOs now will tell you that sustainability issues will fundamentally change the industry in 5 years. And that's all kinds of CEOs. So you have a lot of mainstream issues going. And the issue then is that even though the fragile destinations may work on the ground to put in policy, to put in planning, to make sure they recycle their waste, they're going to go underwater, they're going to be subject to flood, to drought, and they're going to be vulnerable to the impacts that are caused by the majority of the population. And so that's what we do, is we try to work and address the bigger impacts. Now, we help the industry measure and report on sustainability. And the biggest tenet is that you will look at what the big numbers are and say, let's focus on the main impacts. And if you look at what the impacts of travel are, let's call them 3 impacts. It's transportation, the travel to the destination, and then the transportation within the destination. It's the energy and the water consumption from the facilities that you're using, the hotels, the venues, the attractions. And then it's all the waste that's generated. But more importantly is that those impacts are per visitor. So one visitor will have their impact from transportation, from lodging, from activities, and their waste and so forth. And if you multiply that impact by one visitor times a larger number, you start to find where the major impacts are. Example of Huayna Picchu, the top mountain part of Machu Picchu, has a carrying capacity of like 400 people per day. So that's about 150,000 visitors per year, and they've done a good job there to limit the number of visitors. But you get more tourists in one day in Orlando or Vegas or Hong Kong than you do in the entire year to Huayna Picchu. So if you look at the impacts that those tourists have on the planet, then that's where some efforts should be focused. But what we do is we actually try to help look at those numbers and make sense of it and say this is where you should focus your impacts. We work with a lot of events. An event that has 30,000 people in one destination at one time, if you can green that event, then you can make a major impact because that one event in 1 week will generate the same waste as one urban hotel in the entire year. And more importantly, if you can help increase awareness to those 30,000 people in 1 week about how they can be responsible travelers, then you have an opportunity to make real impacts. And so one of the things that we're seeing is that sustainability is mainstream. Cities now are becoming the focus. That's where the major impacts come, and that's where a lot of the innovation is going on at the same time. You're seeing that cities themselves are tourist destinations, and that's the change that we need to think about, is, yes, you have the special interest travel to go visit the Eco Lodge, to go visit the indigenous community, to go to that pristine beach, but we need to start thinking about sustainable tourism for mainstream destinations, like New York, like Orlando, like Vegas. Before, we wouldn't have thought that, right? Oh, Orlando, it's not sustainable. Vegas, no, that's crazy. No, I'm going to go get my sustainability on the beach somewhere. But now, it's different, because we need to start thinking about the 75 million to the 50 million people that go to Orlando every year and how we can help change their impacts. And so that's why if you are going to be living in a big city, you're going to be working for a company, to start thinking about how your activities on a day-to-day can help build sustainable tourism. So we're seeing a lot of shift, and this is the biggest shift we're going to see in sustainable tourism in the next few years, is the transition and the focus on large cities, large destinations, and large impacts. And so we're seeing that cities themselves are starting to address this. And again, some of the major tenets, the fact that New York City, you can get here from major markets by train, by bus. You can get from the airport to downtown in public transit. It's a walkable destination. You have things like that, car sharing, bike sharing, these kind of things to help on transportation. You have the potential then in cities to really, really mitigate the major impacts and cut down the carbon footprint, cut down that water consumption, cut down that waste that will then go and impact the other destinations that we want to go visit. And so what I would suggest is that sustainable tourism also, as an attraction for special interest travel, had been one of the tenets for the last 20 years. I'm going to go have that experience. But I would say let's think about it a little differently, because going forward, the way that cities now themselves and destinations in large urban scales are starting to address this will itself become an attraction for you to go visit. I mean, cities look at like Masdar City in Abu Dhabi. Planning a city that is carbon-free and car-free, that's an attraction. Singapore, where I live, the stuff that's going on in Singapore to make it a sustainable destination for its inhabitants is really amazing. And then you have attractions like Gardens by the Bay and ways that you can now live and interact sustainably. So as this goes on, and it's not only abroad, in the US you have a lot of major cities. The mayor's office is working on striving to be the greenest city in America. You look at Portland, Seattle, even Orlando, what Bloomberg was doing in New York. You have major city initiatives to make their cities the most sustainable for inhabitants. But that also goes for all the travelers to those destinations, like the millions of tourists who come to New York every year. And so we're going to see a lot more focus on cities themselves. That's really the thinking, is we need to change our thinking about sustainability as being something niche to thinking about in our day-to-day. And it's really attuned because this change of thinking is, I think, the heart of what sustainable development is and sustainability is. I really think it's a thought revolution. It's a revolution in the way we think. And I think it's very similar I'd like to think about the scientific revolution back 500 years ago, which was another major way that people started changing the way they thought. Now, we had the concept of heliocentrism. Back in 1500s was a theory. This is a theory that the Earth revolved around the sun. And that was revolutionary. Before, we used to think that the Earth was the center of the universe. And then Copernicus and his colleagues come along and said, I think it's more complex than that. And so in 1543, they came up with this idea. And then it started gaining traction. And all of the innovation, creativity, thought, what we know today about astronomy, chemistry, physics, engineering, modern science, all spawned from that one idea. Now, it was, on one hand, the external, but also the internal. In the same year, you had studies saying that human anatomy is a little bit different. There's actually a skeletal system, that blood doesn't come from the liver. Blood's actually a part of the that actually circulates in the system. So you have an intrinsic look, and you have a look to the stars to think about the way we exist here. And sustainability is kind of the same, because it's a matter now of us thinking about how we live on a finite planet with finite resources, and how we have the ability to measure everything that we're doing in activity, that everything has a carbon footprint, every activity, and that carbon footprint is our contribution and our participation and our limit on this planet. And so, in conclusion, I encourage you to think about this. We had 200 years, it took 200 years for the idea of heliocentrism to become mainstream. Now you really can't be a human being in society without thinking the Earth revolves around the sun. But sustainability, we don't have 200 years to change. We have about 20. And so this major shift needs to go on thinking. And I would say then to you as students, think about in your jobs, in your lifestyles, in your activities here, how you can be more sustainable and help contribute to a destination, a big city, becoming known as a sustainable tourism destination. Thank you.